Hello and welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World. So I was in Memphis last week and this last weekend for FreedomFest, which is a wonderful conference for which I am an ambassador. And I invite you to FreedomFest next year in Las Vegas. It alternates in Las Vegas, out of Las Vegas every other year. So this year they went to Memphis, which was exciting for me because in 1993, as you may or may not know, and if you don't, I'll take you down memory lane, I was hosting a show on MTV called Alternative Nation. And my show sponsored a summer tour with Screaming Trees, Soul Asylum, and Spin Doctors. And we kicked off the tour in Memphis, spent several days there. And it was one of the funnest experiences I had while I was at MTV, hanging out with these bands in an incredible city, felt safe walking around. You could feel the musical history and the Southern vibe everywhere you went. And it was a phenomenal experience because Memphis was at the center of it. So I was really excited to return to Memphis for FreedomFest. And it was a vastly different experience. And it made me really, really sad because as I was getting ready to go, people were like, where's FreedomFest this year? I was like, oh, I'm going to Memphis. And like, don't leave your hotel room. I thought people were over exaggerating because somewhere in between Memphis's incredible history, not only with music, but in terms of the civil rights struggle and its current state of affairs, which can be reflected in crime statistics. The truth of the city obviously lies somewhere in between. As an outsider, I was struggling to find it. I was struggling to find that magic. And it was a lot harder than I thought. And, maybe memories are just rosier when you're 30 years removed from the actual experience. But I knew that whatever I had connected with in Memphis was still there, but it was a lot tougher to find. And part of that is the fear that you walk around with and not wanting to walk around because you hear about things that have happened in the city with residents there. And, obviously the police have taken a lot of heat. Not only for the Tyree Nichols case, he was the skateboarder who was pulled over by 3 unmarked police cars and a traffic stop, and he was beaten to death. And from all accounts, he didn't do anything wrong. The police were quickly charged, and the city has been re-traumatized by that and other kind of high-profile events that it hurts on the inside, but when you're looking in from the outside, it makes people feel unsafe going there. I don't like to go to cities. I don't like to go to places where I can't walk around. It's really important for me to feel a city either by running through it or walking through it and getting to know it. But it was so different than the last time 30 years ago because it was so vibrant. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like everything it was supposed to be, creative and gritty and kind of raw, but very hospitable. And this time, walking around, what struck me and Isabella, whom I work with, we were walking around going, man, this place is really deserted. We would look out from the 19th floor of our hotel room and you just didn't see people on the streets. And on a hot July Sunday, because we were rained into Memphis, because apparently planes can't fly in rain anymore, which is very tragic. So 2 weekends in a row had flights either severely delayed or in the case of Sunday canceled. So we had a sort of mulligan day, didn't get to get around much during Freedom Fest. So we went to Graceland, we went to Central Barbecue, we went to the Peabody Hotel and watched the Duck March, which was amazing and also nostalgic for me, having seen that back when we had the Alternative Nation summer tour. But we wanted to walk around. We wanted to see the city. So, we took an Uber from Graceland to Central Barbecue and walked to the Peabody Hotel. And the Uber driver who dropped us off was like, don't go left, only go right, walk straight, don't talk to anybody, don't go on any side streets at all whatsoever. And this is a guy who lives there. And normally, Uber drivers, they'll tell you about their personal experiences. They'll tell you why they live in a city, why they moved to a city, what they love about it, why it's great, working their own hours for Uber or Lyft. But this guy was very adamant that we not stray from the path It felt like American Werewolf in London, beware the Moors. And I don't like being in places that feel like that, but I really, really want to love Memphis. And a city obviously has to be more than its history. But you go to the crime statistics. So last year, Memphis, for the size of city, had a lot of homicides, 302 homicides. It's a city of about 600,000 people. It's about the same size as my hometown, Portland, Oregon, which is also in decline for other reasons. It's definitely a city that might be in a death loop. In New York City, there were about 430 homicides last year. It's a city of 8 million people, and it still felt like there were a lot of homicides in New York City living here. So that was quite a contrast. And, the residents complain that the police there, and I know the police are getting a lot of heat, and it's got to be a very, very tough place to do community policing and active, engaged policing. But my goodness, they will pull people over for minor traffic infractions and get them in the system. And we've seen this in places like Ferguson and Baltimore, where once you get in the system and you can't pay the fines, then they only escalate. Then there's a bench warrant out for your arrest. And if you are accused of anything else, they arrest you. And, and that in itself is its own incarceration death loop. So Memphis kind of suffers from that. But then at the same time, there are parts of the city, there are neighborhoods where there's a lot of gang activity and neighbors see it and they report it and police don't do much about that. So there's a feeling of helplessness. There's also a great deal of poverty, and the residents complain that, the great factory jobs that were once there where people thrived, they're not there anymore. And they have, it's a big FedEx hub and it's a big distribution city, but they also complain that those aren't the kind of jobs that long-term support the middle class. So what do people do when they're underemployed and at times over-incarcerated? They sell a lot of drugs because you make a lot more money selling drugs than you do a bunch of other stuff. And of course, obviously, drugs are illegal. There's a big black market. Everything is in cash. And, with black markets and cash come other forms of crime. So as a libertarian, I'm looking at the city going, there has to be a way to save these once great dying cities, because it's through no fault of the people who live there. They're trying their best to vote in members of city council and a mayor and, hopefully have a police chief who can work together to ultimately make things better. But in a way, when you walk around, it was so odd to me that there was no police presence. The only police we saw the entire time we were there, we saw one Shelby County sheriff's car that was just parked. And I'm not saying that Memphis has to turn into a police state, but when you have engaged officers that you see, it gives people who are visiting a sense of, oh, they're looking out for me. They're going to make sure that bad guys do me no harm. And didn't see a lot of bad guys, saw a lot of lurkers, saw two dudes lurking around in an 8-person golf cart. Didn't seem like an official vehicle. They were riding it along the trolley tracks. Didn't get on board the golf cart. Didn't see a golf course anywhere near, but I'm sure there are some because Tennessee is a beautiful, beautiful state. But it was very odd. The only police presence we saw were that Shelby County Sheriff's Cruiser and then a police officer at the airport sort of directing traffic as we crossed from one island at the departure levels into the actual airport. I wanted to know the city so much more, and I've gone on sort of a deep dive. What can be done to revitalize cities like this? And Detroit suffered a very similar fate. I went there in 2013 when I was working as a correspondent for John Stossel to really, take in the blight. And that's when houses in certain parts of Detroit were selling for like $1,300. Like you could buy an entire house. It was a little rundown. These houses needed work for $1,300. But, in Memphis, You don't have the same level of blight, whereas, in Detroit, the greenery was literally overgrowing and eating certain buildings and entire blocks in the city. But there was this crackle in the air of stillness. And it's the kind of stillness that you feel before a giant storm, or if you live in Southern California or parts of the world, it's what you remember feeling before there's an earthquake. And we walked, several blocks. We walked to the Peabody. We walked back to our hotel. Didn't see a lot of people. Didn't see a lot of tourists. Saw a couple of people who looked like locals just tooling around on bird scooters. Saw a lot of homeless people that were very different from New York homeless people. New York homeless people are all tranked out and agitated, a lot of yelling, a lot of scratching at their own skin. They're disheveled. They seem like they just popped into a cityscape out of someone's nightmare. And in Memphis, the homeless were so peaceful and still. I stopped and watched a couple of them to make sure they were breathing, and they were. But it was the stillness that had overtaken the city, which seems so odd since this is a city that, to many of us, is based in music. And when you go there, you want to feel the hum of musical creativity, not just on Beale Street, but that sort of universal creative connectedness that is palpable when you go into creative hubs like that. And that, by and large, as you walk around the city, was still. And we went into the pyramid. We went into the Bass Pro Shops pyramid, and it was impressive. We had Wahlburgers. We did pretty much everything we could do, but there obviously is a disconnect by the people in Memphis who I get the sense feel forgotten and overlooked and not necessarily cared for, and by, the entrepreneurs who want to revitalize the city, but it's almost like they have two completely separate lives and two totally different conversations happening at the same time. Here's one part of the city, they're like, we are so poor, we have run out of hope, the police don't care about us, we don't have jobs, you have given up on us. And the other side of the city, the entrepreneurs who are like, let's revitalize the boardwalk. Won't that be amazing? Let's build land bridges. Let's build a bike path from one side of the Mississippi to the other. And it's like, that all sounds great, but you have to work in concert with one another. And the one thing I know is governments do not deliver hope. They extinguish it. And it will require much more investigation on my part to figure out how exactly that has happened in Memphis. But for the most part, like Detroit, like even Chicago, these are cities that have been abused and mishandled that deserve to be saved. And there has to be hope for the individual that exists outside of government that will manifest in some beautiful and very possible, maybe it's unlikely, but it is a very possible spontaneous order. So places like Memphis can thrive and hum again. I believe in it. I cannot wait to go back and see how the city's path unfolds. This has been Kennedy Saves the World. I'm Kennedy.